My microphone is working. Sorry about that. I guess I don't need that much water. That's all right. Hey, about the pizza thing next week, I appreciate Greg's announcement about that. He said it's free, and well, it sort of is free. You can't just show up at 11:30 and eat pizza. You got to be here to listen to me talk, and then talk around your tables, and then you get free pizza. That's the deal. So that's the arrangement. If it's okay with you this morning, folks, I'd like to share something from my heart as we get going today. I've told you more than once, several times probably, how much this church means to me, and how much you as a group of seniors in this church mean to me. And by the way, if this church is not your church, if you're just here on Wednesday mornings, and I know that's true for some of you, that's fine. That's really more than fine. Fact is, this might be a good time to announce to you, those of you who don't regularly come to here on the weekends, if you're not a member of this church or a regular attender of this church, that even without asking for your permission, we have adopted you into our Encompass family. You're one of us, and we're glad you're here. But it's as that family, as brothers and sisters in Christ, that I'd like to share something from my heart as we get started this morning. And it's not bad, by the way. If your normal reaction whenever somebody says that they'd like to share something from the heart is to think the worst and to hang on to your chair and say, oh no, here it comes, I hope that you're relaxed, please. What I want to say to you is not bad. In fact, I think it's good. But friends, something has been going on in my life lately, particularly as I look at myself in the mirror first thing in the morning. I need to stop doing that. And the thing that has been happening is an increasing acceptance on my part that the term senior now applies to me. Actually, it has for some time now. You don't get the Art magazine for 20 years and without kind of being up there. But the deal is that I'm now getting used to the idea of being a senior. That's what's been floating around in my head lately. And the thing about that is that there is now within me a greater and greater sense of urgency about something. And I know as soon as you hear a man my age talk about a sense of urgency, that's not what I'm talking about. Yeah. At least not this time. What I'm talking about now is an urgency, an increased sense of urgency for me as I get older to get things right with God, That's always been important, of course, has been for me. But I got to tell you that there is now within me, as a senior, a deep feeling that I am entering now the home stretch of my life, whether it lasts for years or decades. I have no way of knowing. But when it comes to spiritual matters, I have a strong feeling that I simply must give it all I've got. I don't know about you, friends, but Christianity has never been casual for me. It's never been just one aspect of my life, one part among many parts. It's my life. Christianity. My Christian faith. All of my life. Every bit of my life. Now please, friends, don't get me wrong. My commitment to Christ on the one hand and my own personal behavior on the other hand, how I have sometimes honored Jesus with what I've thought and said and done, and how I have sometimes, and all too often, in fact, dishonored him with what I have thought and said and done. My commitment to Christ and my personal behavior have been and still are, I must confess to you, sometimes two very different things. I have done many, many things in my life that have been dishonoring to my Lord. and deeply hurtful to him and to others. And if you're looking for any juicy details about that, you can forget about it. But the thing is that these days, to put it bluntly, I feel more and more when I try to live out my Christian commitment that there is now just no time to waste, you know? I don't know, maybe it's because a friend of mine exactly my age, one of my best friends, a friend of 50 years, died of leukemia this past Tuesday. You know, but the thing is that at this stage of my life, I'm just getting a clear sense that now is the time for me to double down and to really get things right with God. That's the urgency I feel these days. And the thing is, gang, the reason I say this about myself, I wouldn't waste the oxygen that it takes to say it if I didn't think that it also applied to you. This is not just autobiographical here. In other words, I strongly suspect that what I am saying about myself right now in these minutes also affects you to some degree these days. I don't know for sure, of course, if you would agree with me or not, or even if you thought about it or not. But if you want to know my prayer, one of my prayers for you is that there might be a similar kind of urgency, a similar kind of intensity within you about matters of faith. Now, some of you I'm beginning to know quite well, and I know that that's already true. I see you, and I look at your faith, and it inspires me. You really do. I may be your teacher this morning, but I have learned so much. So much about faithfulness and about resiliency and about constancy in the Word. I've learned so much from so many of you. I really have. But guys, you know what? I want that for everybody. Everybody here, everybody everywhere, every single one of us. I'm willing to admit that as I get to my own personal finish line somewhere out there, again, I have no idea when that might be, that I just want to get more and more serious about my faith and my Lord and His Word. But I want that for all of us, you know? So I say what I say because I think it applies to all of us. There's a race to be completed, gang. And thankfully it doesn't involve our bodies. That'd be a bad deal there. But it's a race just the same. A race that does involve our perseverance, our constancy. Would you pray with me, please? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, friends, I'm really glad you're here today because a man named Luke is going to help us get a grip on what it means to be a mature Christian. You know, I got to say that I have fallen in love. Quite literally fallen in love in an entirely manly and platonic way, mind you. I've fallen in love with each of these men that we've considered so far in this study. Paul, first and foremost, of course, especially after his conversion. But also Barnabas, and John Mark, and Silas. Each one of these men have taught me something. And in different ways, they have deepened my faith, as I would hope would also be the case for you. But you know, Luke stands out in several ways. And I really do think that a greater understanding of his life can and will help us grow and mature in our faith. Because, gang, Luke really was a special kind of guy. You probably get tired of me hyping one man after another in each of these lessons. And if you do get tired of that, I can't say that I blame you, but the truth is that every single one of these men that we've looked at so far, Barnabas and John Mark and Silas and even Paul himself, every single one of these men were, in fact, human beings with strengths and weaknesses, abilities and disabilities, good points and bad points, and therefore not perfect in any way, really. But Luke really was a unique kind of guy. For one thing, it's virtually indisputable that Luke wrote more than a quarter of the New Testament. He authored the gospel that goes by his name, of course, the gospel according to Luke, which has more chapters, 24, in fact, more chapters than Mark's gospel, more chapters than John's gospel. Only Matthew's gospel is a little bit longer. And of course, as you've heard me say, let's say about 8 million times or so, Luke also wrote the book of Acts, which has 28 chapters and is, as you know, the primary source of information about Paul and his company and other leaders of the early church and of the early church itself. But put those two books together, the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, and it amounts to just a little over a quarter of the New Testament. Turn, please, to Luke chapter 1, very beginning of Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, and follow along as I read these words to you. Very beginning of Luke, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the Lord. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Now turn quickly, please, to the beginning of Acts. Acts chapter 1. I think it's the first 5 verses or so. Acts chapter 1. Yeah, first 5 verses. And follow along here. These also are Luke's words. In my former book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus began to do and to teach until the day he was taken up into heaven, after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles he had chosen. After his suffering, he presented himself to them and gave many convincing proofs that he was alive. He appeared to them over a period of 40 days and spoke about the kingdom of God. On one occasion, while he was eating with them, he gave them this command: do not leave Jerusalem, but wait for the gift my Father promised, which you have heard me speak about. For John baptized with water, but in a few days you will be baptized with the Holy Spirit. A few things to notice here, gang. Put one finger, if you would, please, at the beginning of Luke, and another finger at the beginning of Acts, because you're probably going to go back and forth a little bit here. But notice, first of all, please, Luke's own personal acknowledgement that he wrote 2 books to a man named Theophilus. 2 books that basically turn out to be one continuous story, part 1 and part 2. And Luke, you will notice, especially from what he says at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, part 1 of his story, Luke considers himself to be a serious historian. He knows that there are other stories of Jesus out there. Many have undertaken the effort to write things down about Jesus, he says. And in fact, we do know, or we're pretty sure, that Mark and Matthew both beat Luke to the punch when it came to telling people about Jesus, and probably in that order, by the way. First Mark, then Matthew. But Luke isn't concerned here about who wrote about Jesus first, or even about how many wrote about Jesus. No, he makes it clear, Luke does, that he is more concerned about accuracy, and that he has, in fact, as he says, carefully investigated everything from the beginning and made every attempt to write an orderly account, as he says, about Jesus. Luke, in other words, friends, is doing everything that he can do to approach things as a historian, concerned about accuracy and details and things like that. We don't know, by the way, very much about this guy named Theophilus. The name Theophilus was a Greek name, most likely, which meant loved by God, which has led some Bible scholars to believe that Luke didn't write either one of these two books, either the Gospel of Luke or the book of Acts, to any one person in particular, but instead maybe to all people loved by God. But the problem with that is that Luke addresses his gospel to most excellent Theophilus, a title that you might use back then to refer to some kind of respected government official, which makes it seem that Luke was writing to one person in particular and not to lots of persons. That title, Most Excellent Theophilus, you'll notice, is used only in Luke's gospel. You're flipping back and forth between Luke and Acts. It's used only in Luke's gospel and not in the book of Acts, which could mean that Theophilus held some sort of government position when Luke wrote his first book, but that he no longer held that position by the time Luke got around to writing his second book. For what it's worth, I think that Theophilus was a real person whom Luke actually knew. Luke himself, by the way, was probably a Gentile Christian, a Christian who had not been a Jew first, and the only one of the four gospel writers, by the way, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who was a Gentile. And it could be that he was writing to another Gentile Christian, whom he knew, a Greek Gentile Christian named Theophilus, in order to tell him what he, Luke, knew about Jesus. But we really don't know that much about Theophilus. But gang, the thing, one thing is for sure, if Luke wrote what we know as the Gospel of Luke, and if Luke wrote what we know as the book of Acts, or the Acts of the Apostles, both of which are virtually indisputable, then what that means is that Luke's two books take up roughly 27% of the New Testament, which is more than anybody else, including Paul, by the way. If you heard that Paul dominates the New Testament, he does in one way. He writes more books, more letters. But many of his letters are shorter. And so Paul's writings constitute about 23% of the New Testament. And John, who wrote 5 books of the New Testament, the Gospel of John, the 3 letters of John, and the Revelation of John, John comes in third place with about 20% of the New Testament. So if my math is correct, and oftentimes it is not, that means that these 3 men, Luke and Paul and John, in that order, these 3 men are responsible, Luke, Paul, and John, for 70% of the New Testament that we have. And what that means is that the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and then just a few other letters or books that we find in the New Testament, like Peter and James and Jude, they all make up the remaining, all of them make up the remaining 30%. That little piece of trivia, by the way. And $5 will get you a cup of coffee at Starbucks. But my point, friends, is that Luke wrote more of the New Testament than anybody else. And yet, gang, listen to this. This is important. This is something that I think you really do need to know about Luke. With all that Luke did write, more than anybody else, his name occurs only 3 times in the entire New Testament. And get this, none of those 3 times are found in what Luke himself wrote, but only in the 3 separate letters that Paul wrote. In other words, friends, Luke just doesn't talk about himself. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we're talking about a humble guy here, friends. A very humble guy. which just may be the best thing or maybe the most important thing that we can learn about Luke or from Luke. I mean, he really did have one and only one major objective as far as his life was concerned, and that was to tell the story. To simply tell the story as accurately and as completely as he could, based on the information that he could get about who Jesus was, and about what Jesus did, and about who Paul was, and about what Paul did, and others, and then about the early church, without injecting anything of himself into that story. You know, it was John the Baptist who said about Jesus, I love these words, by the way. It's the best thing that John the Baptist says in the New Testament, at least among the things that we know John the Baptist said. John the Baptist said, he, Jesus, must increase, but I must decrease. Luke never met John the Baptist, as far as we know. But what I've come to learn about Luke in the past couple of weeks is that that's exactly how Luke lived his life. Luke lived his life always wanting to increase Jesus and to decrease himself. What he wrote was never about himself. Even though he wrote more than anybody else in the New Testament, it was all about Jesus and only about Jesus and about the church of Jesus. And friends, I've thought about that a lot lately. I don't know about you, but I wish that I could say that about myself. I wish that I could say that what I said or what I did was only about glorifying Jesus. I would like to say, or mean it when I say it, or have others know that I meant it when I said it. He must increase. I must decrease. That's what John the Baptist said. He must increase. I must decrease. But that's how Luke lived his life. He was a humble guy. Luke was a servant first and foremost of Jesus Christ, but a servant also of the Apostle Paul, as Paul himself was a servant of Jesus Christ. There are 5 passages in Acts I'd like to point out to you quickly this morning, real quickly. We're going to try something a little different here this morning. Turn first, please, to Acts chapter 16. These are all in the book of Acts. And they're all in order, so you won't be shuffling too many pages here. But turn, please, to Acts chapter 16, verses 10 through 17, where Luke tells us about Lydia's conversion in Philippi, and where he tells us the beginning of the story we read last week about Paul and Silas in prison. I'm not going to say anything about this passage right now, but I simply want you to look at it briefly. Take just a minute to read Acts chapter 16, verses 10 through 17. Read it silently to yourself now, just for a minute or two. Acts 16, 10 through 17. I don't know if you've completed that or not, and if you haven't, that's all right. But I'd like to have you turn now, please, to Acts chapter 20, verses 5 through 15. Acts 20, 5 through 15, where Luke talks about Paul's travels through Macedonia and Greece and then on to Troas. Acts 25 through 15. Look at those verses, just silently. All right, now turn please to Acts chapter 21, verses 1 through 18. I'm probably moving too fast, but that's okay. Acts 21, 1 through 18, where Luke writes about going to Jerusalem. Take a look at those, if you would, please. Acts 21, 1 through 18. Give you a minute or two. All right, turn now please to Acts chapter 27, verses 1 through 37. Acts 27, 1 through 37, where Paul sails to Rome and gets shipwrecked along the way. Just kind of scan those words, because that's quite a bit of reading here. Just want you to look at this. Kind of get the gist of what's going on here. All right, now lastly, please turn to Acts chapter 28. I think that's the last chapter in Acts, isn't it? I'm not sure. Acts 28, verses 1 through 16, where Luke tells us about Paul going to Malta and then finally over to Rome. Acts 28, 1 through 16. Just a minute or two. All right, I'm wondering, friends, what you might see in these 5 passages. What might jump out at you? I'm not done talking, by the way, this morning. Sorry about that. But take a couple minutes, just a couple minutes around your tables now to visit with each other and see if you can come up with anything as a group that you believe ties these 5 passages together in any way. A couple minutes.
Any commonalities?
Listening, kept saying, that was my observation.
That was a lot.
Yeah.
Keep guessing.
But at the same time, he was very relational. He was always bringing time. Yeah, that was something.
There's some similarities I'm not getting.
Yeah, my Bible doesn't.
Keep guessing.
I didn't even get to that because I didn't know the answer. There was no time to read about it for the top part. Well, usually when it started out, everything was started out.
Give her a Cupid doll.
Yeah. But it never tells you the lead.
He says bleach. Yeah, a lot.
All right, time is up.
Luke was with them on this.
I want to see if you picked up on anything about these 5 passages. What do you see? What ties these 5 passages together? There's a right answer to this question. This is not one of those Bible studies where anything it says to me is all right. No. There's a right answer to that question. What ties these 5 passages together? The answer is that Luke says that he was with Paul when these things happen. They are, in fact, these 5 passages taken together. They're called the we passages of Acts. These 5 passages are the 5 places only in the book of Acts where Luke says that he was actually with Paul. In other words, Luke says that he was an eyewitness. Maybe not to everything that Paul did, but to at least some of the things that Paul did. he, Luke, was actually there with Paul, at least at certain times, which leads scholars to believe that Luke may have come and gone at various times when Paul traveled from place to place. He wasn't always with Paul, but he was sometimes with Paul. And yet, even when he was with Paul, even in those times when Luke counts himself as being among those who traveled with Paul, it's never about him. It's never about him personally. As far as he's concerned, he's just one of a number of people whom he calls we. I think that's interesting. Luke was with Paul sometimes, but he maintains his sense of humility. Luke, you're probably a doctor by profession, a physician. Again, you'd never know that from Luke himself, of course, because he never talks about himself. It's Paul who tells us that Luke was a doctor. Turn please to Colossians chapter 4, Paul's letter to Colossians in the New Testament, chapter 4, verse 14. It's when Paul ends that letter, his letter to Colossians, and he writes from prison, "Our dear friend Luke, the doctor, and Demas send greetings." What that one sentence does, guys, is to lead some Bible scholars to think that Luke might actually have been Paul's personal physician. In other words, a doctor traveling with Paul, if not everywhere Paul went, if not all the time, at least to a lot of places that Paul went, at least some of the time, including sometimes even prison. But you know, one thing's for sure, if anybody ever needed a personal physician, a doctor to be with him sometimes, and Paul was probably the one, you know? I mean, look at 2 Corinthians. This is interesting. Look, turn to Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, 11th chapter, verses 23 through 27. And look at those verses with me, please, where Paul gives us a pretty good idea of how important it might have been for him to have a doctor with him. 2 Corinthians 11, 23 through 27. "I have worked much harder," these are Paul's words, "I have worked," to the Corinthians, "I have worked much harder, been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. You know what that means? 40 lashes was considered to be a death sentence. That was the same as executing somebody. Nobody would survive 40 lashes. So if they said that you had to endure 39 lashes, that was like saying, we want to inflict as much pain on you as we can, but without putting you to death. Torturous kind of treatment. Paul says 5 times that happened to him. He goes on, 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and gone without food. I have been cold and naked. And unfortunately, for Paul, friends, that was just the beginning. We don't have time to check all these out, but the fact of the matter is that in addition to what Paul tells the Corinthians, here in these verses, he was sick more times than he could count. He was bitten by a snake. He spent time in dark and damp and rat-infested prisons. And of course, he had some sort of affliction, an affliction as far as we know he had for his entire life. Even though he prayed 3 times for it to leave him, he prayed and prayed and prayed that it might be removed, some sort of physical ailment that he called, in the very next chapter of 2 Corinthians, his thorn in the flesh, an affliction that was apparently never resolved. But the deal is that if anybody ever needed a doctor, Paul probably did. Luke, Dr. Luke, was with him, at least sometimes. Luke was a smart man. He didn't go to medical school. They didn't have medical school back then, but doctors back then were still a lot more educated than most people. They studied philosophy, classical literature. They spoke both Greek and Latin. We know that Luke was a very smart man. He wrote the book of Luke. He was an excellent writer. Many Bible scholars think that the gospel according to Luke is the most beautiful piece of writing in the entire New Testament. Luke was a very smart man, educated man. And he was a devoted man. In fact, there was a time when he was the only remaining friend that Paul had. There was a man named Demas who was with Paul along with Luke when Paul wrote to the Colossians. But Demas eventually left Paul. We looked at this before, but turn please to 2 Timothy, Paul's second letter to Timothy, the 4th chapter, 2 Timothy 4, verses 9 through 11, where Paul is writing to Timothy, and he says, do your best. He's telling Timothy, do your best to come to me quickly. For Demas, because he loved this world, has deserted me. And he's gone off to Thessalonica. Crescens, we don't know who that is, but Crescens has gone to Galatia, and Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. So get Mark. He tells Timothy, get Mark, John Mark, and bring him with you because he is helpful to me in my ministry. As I said last week, maybe it was before last week, Paul was alone in prison. Or almost alone, because Luke was there with him. There's a lot of speculation about Luke. Most say that he never married. He never had any children. Some say that he died at 84 years of age. Very old for that time. Exceedingly old. As a doctor, who knows, maybe he knew a little more about how to take care of himself. Some say that Luke, even if he did live into his 80s, that he didn't die of old age, but that he was hanged. He was executed from an olive tree. But like I say, that's all legend and speculation. What we do know is that Luke wrote about Jesus in his gospel. That he wrote about Paul in Acts. And that he was a humble and devoted man. He did everything he could do to make Christ increase and himself decrease. He was a good guy. He really was. Talk around your tables a little bit.